Hi, and welcome back to Soul Sister US. Sometimes I just say us because it's a podcast about me certainly trying to be more introspective and give you guys a little more insight as to who I am and how I think. But I've also asked my guests to do that. So today is very unscheduled. Um, you know, the look, no makeup. I've asked Eric, my husband, to just jump in and do this. So I'm going to invite him in and see. Hi, Eric. Are you there?
Hello, how are you?
Good. Well, like I was saying for the intro, we decided to do this very last minute, or I asked you and you nicely volunteered.
As opposed to just talking to each other while we're driving into the studio, we're going to formally record this.
Yeah. Well, and so the reason is a couple of weeks ago, I was looking ahead at the calendar, and for the purposes of a memoir I'm working on, I'm not going to say the date, but I woke up and I realized that because it's 2020, it's been 70 years since my grandfather murdered a woman. And I know you've heard the story a lot, so, I guess you've heard it, but I don't know if I've ever asked you what the first thing you thought of or what you thought of when I first told you that I had a grandfather who murdered a woman.
Well, I could say something funny like, oh, that wouldn't surprise me in the least.
Well, that just surprised
But
me.
that would just be a funny answer. That wouldn't necessarily be the truthful answer. I didn't know what to make of it. I know uh, I might have heard you mention it a couple times, and then I remember when we decided to Google some of the stuff. Like I was curious, obviously, to like what's the circumstances, what's this all about, and we started Googling different things to try to find something about uh, that murder, and you ended up after a number of different attempts with different word searches, we came up with something, and we ended up getting a lengthy transcript of a court trial of one of his appeals
Yeah. That
that
shocked me.
had a lot of graphic detail as to what actually happened, which my recollection is it was a bit of a surprise to you
It was a
because your
shock.
recollection was just based on very limited information that you heard from adults when you were a kid,
Hmm.
and kids make certain assumptions because that's what they know.
Well,
You can
you're right.
you can only make assumptions based on what you know, and who would ever uh, think that it actually
Well,
happened the way it did, whether
a-
you're a kid or
and that
not.
they didn't know much, and they didn't really talk about it. I'm glad you brought up the day that we found that transcript because it was a shock. It was a shock because this was a long, long night. I've never seen a time of death listed as, 2 days. But it was pretty compelling when I came across that. The other thing was, as a kid, I just thought, yeah, I don't know. I never heard the word murder. I just heard veiled references. I never knew he got convicted. There were a lot of things that were a surprise, and you know, you may recall. I think you were getting ready to watch the Patriots game, and we were both getting ready. I think it was the home season opener that year, and this was only a few years ago. Um, and called my mother, and her reaction was really a huge surprise too. It was immediate and to the point. Like, what are you doing, digging up that stuff? Drop it. Don't do it. And that kind of leads me to another question. You're aware that most of my family has either just ignored the subject or specifically been in agreement with my mother, that they really don't want to see this memoir written. Um, that's my goal at this point. Um, Big goal, of course, would be a movie of this. It's so profound, but they have many have just given the impression to leave it alone. What do you think about that? As you have lent support to me, you've listened to the story, you've helped me research some things in Massachusetts as well as on the other side of the country where it happened. Um, you know,
I, uh, it's
you're
it
kind of a
seems like
rebel.
uh, maybe um, it's uh, when you ask a question like that, the first thing that comes to mind is, well, what would I do if it was I found out that uh, a distant relative of mine had was involved in a murder or something, and the answer would probably be different because I don't know. Uh, I'm sort of a uh, I'm not I'm not really. I probably, if it was, I probably wouldn't pursue it because I'm more in the present and moving forward than uh, looking back at things. And
Yeah.
so, but that's just me. I know that you're very different, and so I'm curious, and the more you find out about it, uh, and the more you talk with people about it, the more interesting it becomes in terms of a story. And I am interested in storytelling, whether it's in art or uh, video or whatever. So it certainly is an interesting story. And uh, when you watch TV or you go to the movies and you look at some of the stories that you're saying, uh, who came up with that story? Like, it couldn't. There's some really weird stuff out there that ends up being stories, that movies or TV series or whatever. That uh,
Well, one of the weirdest things
so it
I
seems to be a compelling story, not just because somebody died or there's a murder, but more the human element, which is what sort of piqued my curiosity in terms of typically a response to somebody who's a murderer. You think, oh, they're a Charlie Manson type person, and you don't even, nobody stops to think, well, how did Charlie Manson get to be Charlie Manson? And so I
yeah,
think,
I never thought of him as as anything other than this adult I didn't know, and I never thought of him as a child. Um, I um, I worked with a writing coach to try to um, narrow this down. Colin Broderick was great, but he really took me by surprise. He he was very excited about the story and how many of the details, which were shocking. Police reports back then had um, just details that I found unimaginable. But the biggest surprise was when he told me or recommended that I should tell it through me. And I remember saying, I'd only met him once, and that was by accident. Um, and so I was struggling with what that meant. Um, So it's funny that you said you think more in the present because that's what he brought it to. He kind of had to point out to me that he's my grandfather and he's in my blood. And I had not honestly ever, maybe I was too detached. It was just a story. And then when he said that, I really tried to run with it and think what that means. I did come across research, and maybe this is a good way to wrap it up around, um, you know, science suggests that trauma is passed on to us. Now, it begs the question if a relative, well, I was thinking more the trauma he inflicted on people, and in particular the woman who died. But does that pass through? I think what Colin was saying, when you tell it through you, you have to embrace the idea that he's in you, he's part of you, he's a part of your family, and not that distant a relative when you think about a grandfather. Um, so, what do you think about the likelihood? Science does support this, but as you have watched me try to wrestle with this, and I'm asking you as an individual who said you might be more in the present, what do you think about the likelihood that trauma is passed along like that? What does that mean?
Well, typically you would think what's passed on would be your grandfather's whatever was
His
in his
nose.
makeup to make him be a murderer. That okay, you would those traits would be passed on to you. But uh, in talking about things, and there was one particular book that you'd mentioned where they talked about more not necessarily the genetic traits, but more the experience, traumatic experience, the
Right.
experience, the energy that comes with it could be transferred.
It's
And
kind of that
so,
visceral familiarity. I think
yeah,
you're talking about Mark Wolin's book, It Didn't
yeah.
Start With You, which is, I highly recommend.
So we'd had conversations with about trauma that you've had in your life and how you've kind of um, escaped some of it uh,
Yeah, well,
and so the possibility of having the traumatic experience, the sort of visceral thing passed on to you, sort of gave you the capability to unknowingly, unwittingly uh, know when to leave the room or know when to say no or know when uh, to
that's
avoid certain things. And so that's certainly a possibility. And, you know, the older we get to be, the more we find out we don't know. And in addition to that, the more you find out not everything that happens is 100% scientific, factual, provable. You know, the thing about like coincidence, if you think there's a such thing as coincidence because you're not paying attention. So there's
or
oftentimes coincidences aren't really coincidences. And you know, when we meet somebody, the or we were sitting in the parking lot and see a license plate that said Marietta on it.
right.
Just things like that. Just you think that it's mainly because we've lived long enough and we've had enough experiences that there's going to be something that we have in common with somebody else.
One of the biggest ones I just thought of, or most touching, I guess, that I just thought of is our rescue dog, Joe. And I mean, we're in Massachusetts and we find this rescue dog, and his birthplace is Georgia, but it's not just Georgia. It's McKaysville, where you worked as part of
Bannon County, Georgia.
Bannon County, Georgia. And that coincidence or thing that's hard to explain also happened with a terrific musician we know, Walter Parks, and he's tied in with this whole story, and he's been so encouraging too, because we were in Liberty, New York, and learned, or I think we saw his license plate, and it was also McKaysville, Georgia. You start having these links that feel very strange, and it brings me to the name of the show, Soul Sister U.S. At some point, I'll figure out how I want to say that. But what I
If you,
what
if
I
you say
liked,
it the way it looks, it's so sisterous.
Soul
It's
Sisterus.
Latin.
Oh, it's Latin, and I'll have to turn to you. So so thank you for being willing to jump in here with no notice. I guess this morning the overwhelming, back to visceral feeling, was that the day that woman, um, you know, got ready uh, for her day and planned to be out that night. Um, I don't know. I don't even know what to say about it. Maybe I'll have to give that more thought, but I was struck
Well,
by
I
that
think
this
that
morning.
one thing that struck you and I paid attention to was that it wasn't, oh, I want to reconnect with my grandfather. It's sort of that, okay, things happen and you have everybody sort of has this tendency to want to right past wrongs. And so your grandfather, you want to find out what made that, who is this person, how do you get to be who he was and be able to commit a murder. But you also have empathy for the victim, this woman that he murdered, and trying to find out more about that. And you have empathy for her and her situation. And you also find out that, okay, cultural mores were different back then than they are now.
Right.
And you found that by reading the court transcripts and how things were described very matter of factly, but now it sounds, because of how it's described, sounds rather uh,
Well,
odd.
again, I didn't plan on this sort of stream of thought, but having just done a podcast with Vinny Nauheimer, I, I turned to Vinny uh, when Colin first put out this idea of thinking about my grandfather as being in me, which led to thinking about him as a person and a child. And Vinny's work, profound work, is in and around, or advocacy, I should say, clergy abuse. And, I'm not making any speculative suggestions that my grandfather was abused by clergy, but he was the son of an immigrant, very young woman, only in this country not even a year, who got pregnant, and she was strongly devoted to the Catholic Church as an Irish woman. And Vinny and I just tossed around thoughts about 1912 or 1911, the early 1900s, and what she was in the employ, if you will, as a maid for people, and she lived in quarters for the staff. What kind of childhood did he have? How does this happen? I think I can go to the extreme and say he was a sociopath, but but that doesn't really tell much. You know, I think Walter Parks asked a really astute question, because the woman who died wasn't his first victim, and his question was, let's think on what he was what he was looking to take from those women. which is a pretty chilling place maybe to, I don't know if you have any final parting
Oh,
thoughts.
those are things, you're going to have a lot of different questions like that, and then you can try to find answers or create your own answers, and that's sort of how the story gets told.
Right.
And so
So we're going to tell it, right?
it's a work in progress.
It is a work in progress, and I never thought it would be a labor of love, but it definitely has that feel to it, and I'm learning a lot about myself as I'm doing it. It's not an easy task, which is another good reason to not do it, but that's not how I'm wired, as you know. Well, thanks for being on the show.
Okay, let's go home
This
and
is gonna be a
take
show.
care of the dog.
Okay.
Joe's
Okay.
missing us, I'm sure.
I'm sure he is. Thanks, Eric.
Yep, see you.
Bye.